What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the conversation here on TYT. I am your sometimes host, Francesca Fiorentini. It has been a very intense time, and I'm so glad we have our next two guests to dissect everything that's been going on. I'm going to read a little bit from our first guest's recent column in The Nation magazine. January 6, 2021, the day the GOP was finally unavoidably confronted with the lethal consequences of tolerating a demagogue for 4 years. The day the cretinous, opportunistic Republican Party was forced to confront the fact that, as JFK once put it, if you seek to ride the tiger, you end up in its belly. If you tolerate a president who calls neo-Nazis very fine people, if you tolerate a president who tweets support for militias trying to invade the Michigan state capitol, if you tolerate a president who calls the free press enemies of the people, if you indulge a president who threatens private citizens, if you acquit a president impeached for manifestly criminal actions and trying to strong-arm the Ukrainian government into providing dirt on a domestic political opponent, if you turn a blind eye to a president's repeatedly demanding that election officials commit fraud by finding him a predetermined number of votes, if in short, you dally with demagoguery and mob rule in both the political and criminal sense of the word mob, if you buy into a lethal personality cult, eventually those chickens will come home to roost. And those are the very, very telling words of my next guest, Sasha Abramsky, columnist and author of this article, The GOP is No Longer a Viable Governing Party, and the book, Jumping at Shadows, The Triumph of Fear and the End of the American Dream. Sasha, thank you so much for being here.
Francesca, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, of course. And what a perfect way to sum everything that we've seen up. The chickens are coming home to roost. And it has been a wake-up call. I'm just not sure for whom. Do you think that Republicans are hearing the alarm bells sound finally?
I do, and I think they're hearing it for two reasons. One, they were genuinely personally scared, because for 5 years, Donald Trump has turned the mob against other people, against Muslims and Mexicans and Black Lives Matter protesters, against political opponents, against women suing him for sexual harassment, whatever it might be. He's turned the mob against other people. And this time, he, in the most visceral way possible, turned it against legislators. So I think on one level, there's just this realization that this stuff isn't just a game, but it's actually very, very dangerous. And on the second level, there's a pragmatic thing in play here, which is Trump has lost all power. In the last 3 days, we have seen the most remarkable shrinking of this sort of political would-be strongman into a midget. He's just vanished overnight. And by the time your audience sees this interview, it's entirely possible Trump won't be the president anymore. So I think the GOP now has to confront the fact that there is such national and international revulsion at what they have unleashed on the country that unless they get a handle on it, unless they clean house, unless they get rid of Donald Trump, unless they censor Hawley and Cruz, unless they get a handle on these, fascist street fighting gangs who've attached themselves to the party, unless they do that as a governing party, they're dead in the water. Not just for 1 or 2 or 3 election cycles. They will not recover from this because this was literally their own president inciting an armed uprising against the American constitutional system of government.
Yes, absolutely. I want to talk a little bit more about that because I agree with you. I'm there and I truly believe this is a wake-up call for a party that has been sleepwalking into this kind of extremism for so long. And I don't, now exactly. It's like Republicans are always Republicans until their nephew is gay, or their niece was in a mass shooting. And then suddenly they're like, oh, gee, maybe we should have gun control. Or maybe gay rights are important, things like that. But there is an argument out there, which is that no, Hawley and Cruz are the future of the Republican Party. They're gonna clean up. And this sort of anti-reality nut job, wing of the party is gonna continue to call the shots. What are your thoughts on that?
If Hawley and Cruz are the future of the Republican Party, it is a party that's capable of getting 20 to 25% of the electorate. There's no way a party that explicitly links itself to the Proud Boys. And there were people running into that Capitol building wearing T-shirts saying 6 million Jews weren't enough. In other words, the Holocaust wasn't a complete job and they wanted more people killed. There is no way you're going to create a governing majority now that Trump's bubble has burst, now the cult of the personality has burst, and it has all over the place. There is no way in the wake of this wreckage you create a governing coalition based around people like Hawley and Cruz. So if they stay in, if they really are the future of the Republican Party, it's going to resemble the French National Front. It's going to be a party on the edge of politics, capable of becoming a large, noisy minority, but not capable of governing. And you've seen this. You saw it with statements by people like Lisa Murkowski at the end of the week, who said, "Look, if this is the future of the Republican Party, count me out." And I think you'll see that from Mitt Romney. You're going to see it from Ben Sasse. You're going to see it from a growing number of Republicans who want no part in sort of paramilitarism and fascism, which is what Trumpism ended up becoming.
Yes. And yet, and even people who have been on board with Trump policies for the entire time he's been in office, like Mitch McConnell and Mike Pence, are calling out this behavior. In fact, I think we know that Mike Pence was responsible for helping call the National Guard finally to help actually restore some peace in the Capitol. What are your thoughts on that now that here we have these awful urchins that absolutely helped someone like Trump, rise to power, and yet even they are turning their backs?
Look, I've been writing on Trump for 5 years since the primary season in late 2015. And right from the get-go, if anyone was paying attention, it was blindingly obvious that Trump was a demagogue, that he was flirting with fascism, that he was willing to inject violence into the American political system, and that he was using the mob. That was obvious from the get-go. And people like Pence and people like Elaine Chao and all the others who've sort of belatedly, or Betsy DeVos, who've belatedly seen the light and realized just how dangerous he is, it's a little bit late in the day. Because let's just reiterate what's happened in the last 4 years. This is a man who put children in cages. This is a man who asked his Homeland Security people why he couldn't have migrants shot in the legs. It's a man who asked why he couldn't build a moat on the southern border and fill it with alligators. I mean, this man has given many indications that he's clinically insane and that he's a brutalist and a sadist, and they stuck with him. So Pence and all these others now, yes, they're going to get a footnote saying you weren't quite as bad as your boss, but the bulk of the chapter written on them in this period is going to say you were pretty goddamn awful. And I'm sorry if I've sworn there, but there we go.
I think that is allowed. Now, talk to me about the Democrats. How can the Democrats ensure that there is an accountability? How can the Democrats drive a wedge in the Republican Party? Should they be driving the wedge, or should they just be sort of, refuse to work with them now that they have the Senate? What are your thoughts on their play now?
Well, my thoughts looking at this is the Democrats have an extraordinary opportunity that 4 days ago would have been inconceivable. So, number one, they control the US Senate, which means they control the committees, which means they're going to be able to get their legislation put on the floor for a vote. It means they're going to get their judicial nominees through. It means they've got at least a fighting chance of a sensible climate change policy if they can get people like Joe Manchin and some of the other centrist Democrats aboard. But it means the legislative agenda changes. But beyond that, because of what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, there is suddenly this absolutely extraordinary moment when the public is paying attention to just how debased politics has become, just how crude it's become, how based around lies and manipulation of information it's gotten, which gives, again, not just the Democrats, but anyone of good conscience an opportunity to reshape politics. And there's that statement, never sort of let a good crisis go to waste. This is a marvelous opportunity that the Republican Party, through their sheer inanity, have presented the Democrats to actually change politics for the better. Because we've held a mirror up to ourselves and seen what happens when you let extremism run rampant. And the Republican Party has become by default a party of extremists. And so now the Democratic Party can basically fill a void, and they can come in with sensible party politics. They can come in with a voice that isn't based around extremism, and they can craft an agenda that actually can help the public, that can deal with all these, extraordinary crises, from the coronavirus pandemic to the political crisis. The Democrats have an opportunity to actually reshape politics for the better over the next 2 or 4 years. And this is a gift that, paradoxically, this is Trump's last gift. in the sheer awfulness of his exit from power, he's actually opened the door to a better politics at the back end of his presidency.
Absolutely, and they cannot waste it. I think this time it's bigger than partisanship. I just want to ask you one last thing, which is, what is the importance of leadership right now? I mean, in terms of where we go from here, I think we've seen when there's an absence of it, but what are some of your final thoughts on that?
It's absolutely crucial. I mean, Trump was not an absence of leadership. It was an absence of sensible leadership and of decency in leadership. There was leadership. It was leadership of the mob, and it was leadership of a massive propaganda machine, and it was leadership essentially of a cult of the personality. So now we're going to have a government that's actually rational. And we're going to have a government that's actually listening to scientists, and listening to public health experts, and listening to climate experts. It's going to be a huge sea change. And it might not on a day-to-day basis be as titillating or as sort of, bizarrely fascinating as the Trump era, but sometimes calm, quiet, deliberative government, calm, quiet, deliberative government is better than the kind of nonsense that Trump threw up over the last 4 years. So good riddance to this man. Let's get him out of power. Let's get him out of office. Let's move on to a more decent chapter in American history.
Sasha Abramsky, thank you so much for your insights. Everyone, Jumping at the Shadows, The Triumph of Fear and the End of the American Dream is his book, and his column is The GOP is No Longer a Viable Governing Party. Thanks so much. Really good to speak with you.
You too. Take care.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.